Martin Luther King Jr. fought hard for the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law 50 years ago this August. The U.S. has come a long way since the days when African Americans were subjected to poll taxes and literacy tests. But many worry a new kind of voter disenfranchisement is underway. Ryan Haygood, Deputy Director of Litigation at the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund, is with me to talk about what's happening. Ryan, before we get into the challenges that voters face, take me back to the days before the Voting Rights Act bill was signed into law. What was it like for African Americans?
I appreciate that question. It's hard to imagine what it was like pre-Voting Rights Act, given the diversity that we see in our state legislatures across the country today, and given that we've now twice elected an African American to the highest office in the land. But pre-Voting Rights Act, pre-1965, political participation by Black and other people of color was non-existent. I think of Selma, Alabama, for example, where there were 15,000 age-eligible Black Americans who would have otherwise been eligible to vote. But at that time, pre-1965, there were fewer than 100 registered Black voters. And that wasn't because Black voters didn't want to take hold of the promise of democracy, but they simply weren't able to because states erected a number of barriers. Literacy tests that required the recitation from memory of the Alabama Constitution. There's a story, a famous story in Alabama, about how even the most learned African Americans, a man who had earned a PhD, couldn't pass Alabama's literacy test. The Voting Rights Act, the first thing it did was did away with literacy tests. And for that reason, the Voting Rights Act was really a transformative moment in American history.
So you recently co-wrote a report called The Battle to Protect the Vote. You say the United States is experiencing an assault on Voting Rights Act that is historic in its scope and in its intensity. What are you seeing?
Sure. So I think, one of the things that Dr. King taught us is that America's relationship with democracy has always been contested. One that's been characterized by broad expansions of the electorate, followed swiftly by efforts to make voting more difficult for people, particularly people of color. So I think we've seen in the last several years, particularly following the election of President Barack Obama, states erect a number of impediments to the franchise.
What are those impediments?
And the heart, I think, of this effort is the photo ID effort. In the last several years, more than 30 states have either considered and or adopted restrictive, very discriminatory photo ID measures. And this really has sort of become the heart of the voter suppression effort. And it happens at a time in which the demographics of this country are changing. America is projected to be a majority people of color nation by 2042. In the last several election cycles, people of color have participated in historic numbers in elections, and we received a devastating decision from the Supreme Court a couple of years ago that struck a core part of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sure.
When that decision was reached, what was the effect of it?
Sure. So this decision was one in which the Supreme Court struck a core part of the Voting Rights Act. This provision really required some of the places in our democracy that are most sort of entrenched with racial discrimination to submit all of their voting changes to the federal government for approval before they took effect. And this was really a way in which Section 5 operated as our democracy's discrimination checkpoint. When the Supreme Court essentially struck this provision, states were free to enact voting changes, and then they would be challenged after they were implemented. So Texas, for example, within hours of this decision, announced that they were going to implement immediately their photo ID measure. But that had previously been struck by this part of the Voting Rights Act, which is now gone. Texas was able to implement within hours of the decision one of the nation's most racially discriminatory, most restrictive photo ID measures.
So what is the motive for these voter suppression efforts? Why has there been a contraction in voting rights?
I think that's a great question, and it's, when you sort of wrestle with the motivations, it's disillusioning because there is a sense that the way you win an election is either by getting more people out to vote than your opposition, or by shrinking the electorate so that fewer people can participate. The photo ID measure is a good example of a way in which one can make voting more difficult and disqualify any number of people. So in Texas, for example, Texas's photo ID law has disqualified 1 million eligible voters and 600,000 registered voters. These 600,000 registered voters previously used things like utility bills and bank statements, hunting and fishing licenses. They're now required to produce one of 6 kinds of government-issued photo ID, which they don't have.
And very quickly, what's the solution?
The solution is, today I have to say, I came from New York here to San Diego to participate in the San Diego Alliance San Diego's All People's celebration. And I got to tell you, they attracted 1,000 people to this event. And the solution is really finding ways to engage people past the commemoration. Today's Dr. King's birthday. People commemorate his legacy. But democracy is not self-executing, and it really requires maintenance, and it requires us to participate in the maintenance of the democracy to ensure its vibrancy and its inclusion.
We've got to close it there. Ryan Haygood, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.